Good afternoon. I'm here with my guests Jim Harrison and Kim Nagy, and they are the editors of Dead in Good Company, a celebration of Mount Auburn Cemetery. And it's a beautiful book with wildlife photographs. Both my guests are very accomplished wildlife photographs people, and there's poetry and there's essays by a number of prominent people. So it's a really excellent anthology. So thank you for being here. And by the way, it's available on Amazon, I assume, and all the good regular...
And several local bookstores like Porter Square Books.
Okay. Now, and you have a website, right?
We have a Facebook page.
What's it called?
It's Dead in Good Company, all one word.
Dead in Good Company. Oh, you got that, folks? Okay. So when Mount Auburn Cemetery was created in 1831, they envisioned a new concept for the cemetery. In fact, it spawned a new movement. Could you tell me about this, just to give us some background of Mount Auburn Cemetery, which is located on Mount Auburn Street in Cambridge, right?
Well, it was the first garden cemetery in the country, and in fact, Central Park was designed after that.
So was Olmsted involved in this at all? Yeah,
yes.
He was.
And it was consecrated in 1831. Even before that, it was called Sweet Auburn, and it was a place for students and people in the area to just stroll and enjoy. And then the idea for it to become a garden cemetery became reality, and since it's been both a cemetery and a place to explore and a place to appreciate life and to appreciate beauty. So it's still a working cemetery, but if you go there and walk around, it's very easy to forget that it's a cemetery. And if you do what we do, which is photograph wildlife, it's just another place to photograph wildlife, and you get so used to it that the cemetery part you kind of forget. It's a place of serenity, and we always think of it as a place of life.
But I mean,
That's the
I'll ask Kim. I mean, there are a lot of places to observe wildlife, but you guys concentrated on this place. Why?
First of all, their intention to create Mount Auburn Cemetery, to John's point, was that they wanted to change the notion of death and a cemetery as a place of death and endings. And they wanted it to be a circle of life and a place of life. And as to why we photographed there, we met at the cemetery. Oh. And I always say that anyone who suggests meeting at a cemetery for the first time has got to be a very interesting character. That's how we met.
Type of thing. Well, but cemetery made for an interesting movie, yeah. Okay, so it wasn't your standard, place, and it's a good concept that we sort of compartmentalize death, death and life. But here there's a continuum of, death. We die, we become fertilizer, and things sprout up, a part of us. So we're all
rebirth and transformation and circle of life.
You said it much better than I. In all these years that I've lived in Boston area, I've never, I went there for funerals, but I've never did really, I never really looked it over closely, and I found myself looking at these graves and, how you doing, pal? And, and some of the personages who were there. Did you find yourself? I know you're more into wildlife, but how about with the graves and the people there? Do you have a sense? I'm not saying that you saw ghosts or anything, but did you have a sense of their presence, or at least, find yourself in an ongoing conversation?
Well, in the sense that there are a lot of well-known, famous people at rest there, and every once in a while you'll pass by one of their graves, and it will make you think of that and of them. In our first essay by William Martin, the historical novelist, called The Actor and the Hawk, a great deal of his essay deals with the brother of John Wilkes Booth, Edwin Booth. So there are these reminders all over the cemetery, these famous people, Buckminster Fuller and Megan Marshall, this Pulitzer Prize winner, who was one of our contributors. Her book, Margaret Fuller Asoli, the cenotaph is at Mount Auburn Cemetery. So as you walk around and you see these famous memorials, Isabella Stewart Gardner, in fact, at Auburn Lake, it does remind you of that. But I think it's mostly these well-known names that do that for us. Otherwise, we're just there looking for hawks and great horned owls and coyotes and foxes and whatever else we can find in the wildlife realm.
Okay. Now, we were talking about some of the people who are in the book. Dan Shaughnessy, Alan Dershowitz. I mean, they wrote essays about this. Henry Cabot Lodge, which I was very interested in the Henry Cabot Lodge piece written by Ray Flynn, and it turns out that Henry Cabot Lodge, in the end, was an ally of the rascal king Curly.
Right.
Could you maybe talk about that, or who's?
Well, when I went to see Ray Flynn, and he had become a friend, and I would go to his house in Southgate for him to sign his other two books, Pope John Paul and the novel. And I went there one day particularly to ask him to join our group. And first of all, I must say that Ray Flynn is the most enthusiastic person I've ever met. When I asked him to do it, his face lit up. And he said, "Oh my God, John, I'd love to do it. And you know what? I have a story about Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. and the rascal king, Curly, that nobody knows, and that's going to be the subject of my essay," and which it is. But Ray Flynn that day was just enthusiastic and beaming to be part of it and to tell that story that not too many people
Right. I mean,
know.
Lodge being a WASP, blue blood, and him to honor Mayor Curly, who was Irish.
Yeah, they were not known as friends.
Yeah.
They were known as political enemies, and that Ray Flynn was very happy to be able to tell people through that story that wasn't exactly so. That in the end, Henry Cabot Lodge did speak well of Curly, but that was how that happened. And I remember that day well, asking the mayor to join our group, and I love his enthusiasm. Every time I go and see him, that enthusiasm is always there.
I think his son is running for office now.
Yeah. Right.
Alan Dershowitz, had a nice piece about him seeing people who died, and he knew them in life, and so these people were all having, the cemetery was having a great effect on them. I was going to ask you, there was some great, pictures by both you and Jim, obviously. I noticed one, I didn't think it was by you guys, but it was great horned owl with his prey, like headless prey, I think it was almost. That's sort of like, can you talk a bit about that, how he got that? He just was there at the right time, or?
Well, there's plenty of prey for the owls.
Yeah.
And going back to your earlier question about do we have conversations with anything or one in the cemetery, mine is always about, take off, please, can I get that shot? Take off, please, usually to the animals. And to get a predator with prey, if you're a photographer, that's a very big deal. Mm-hmm. It's a bit gruesome for people who don't know or understand, but the fact of the matter is most people are carnivores. It's just that we go to the supermarket and it's a little bit nicer than ripping the head off of a squirrel or something like that.
Yeah, I wouldn't get much enjoyment out there. I always wondered about those guys in the old times where they would, in the meat packing plants, their one job was to hit the cow with the hammer.
Right.
That was their one thing must have done a number on their heads. So that was by Phil Sorrento, am I not mistaken? Mm-hmm. Photographer Phil Sorrento.
One of our contributors, Paul Roberts, the raptor expert of Medford, if you remember, his title is Praying at Mount Auburn Cemetery, Preying. Mm-hmm. And his essay is devoted to primarily red-tailed hawks, but he is a raptor expert, and it's a wonderful essay, a wonderful exposure to the species.
Okay. Now, owls and owlets inspired you. You were going through a particularly trying time in your life, and these owls and owlets, you're fascinated by them, and they sort of kept your mind off things, and you were, sort of passionate about that. Maybe you can talk a little about this, because I know, as an artist, a poet, often, in your bad times, you just go into your work and get lost, you know. So I'm wondering about your experience. It'd be interesting.
Well, wildlife photography and nature helped me to rebuild myself during a very challenging time when I became a reluctant caregiver.
Okay, to your mother.
Yes. And when I went to the cemetery, I didn't necessarily see a cemetery. And I had lost a job on top of all that, an executive job, and was a reluctant caregiver. I went a lot because I had the time, and then people would ask, well, what are you doing all day? Because I used to be very busy and traveled. And I said, oh, I go to the cemetery. And they think, oh no, going to the cemetery every day. But it wasn't anything like that. And so the owls helped me reestablish and helped me rebuild who I used to be. And photography, like life, is all about focus. And so when you focus on a subject, everything else falls away.
Tell me about you. You were communing with the owls, weren't you?
I wouldn't call it communing other than asking to take off and get the shot or something like that. But the fact of the matter is that I felt very close to them. And it was a very magical experience. The whole going into the dell and the darkness and the owl and looking for the owl.
The owl. It's a very fascinating bird. What fascinates you about that bird?
Well, the owl, unfortunately,
And it seems to be like an icon of the cemetery, kind of.
well, a lot of people associate throughout the past and throughout history the owl with death. The fact of the matter is they tend to like conifers, they like coniferous trees, and a lot of old growth trees are found only in cemeteries. So it's not as if the owl is they say it's a harbinger of death, but it's a habitat that they really like. But there is a personal reason, actually, with the owls and my connection, which I didn't find out till just last year. And that was kind of ironic. I've always loved owls.
Okay. Do you know what? Can you share what that?
I was in Guatemala, and I'd climbed a volcano, and I actually had rented a horse, and then I felt sorry for the horse, so I walked with the horse all the miles, and the guides thought I was totally crazy. And we all walked, and the horse was following us. And
Well, you went up a volcano. I mean, I
Yes.
usually go to a Holiday Inn, but you're walking.
no,
up
this was a very intense experience.
Yeah.
And so we come through, and it's actually 2 years later, still hot. So part of the tour, they have marshmallows, and they put a stick, and then they put it down. And 2 years later, the marshmallow toasts.
Oh.
So we finally walked to this clearing, and there's a store called the Volcano Store. We're on a volcano. It's Guatemala. It's not like there are Store 24s and Starbucks anywhere. And so I go in there, and high altitude, hours of hiking, very tired. And there's an expat there, and they have a big sign, and they talk about how the ancient Maya believed that when a soul incarnated, they had an animal spirit that was with them their whole life, from birth to death. And they asked me my date of birth and the year and the month. It got very specific. And he came up with it, and he said, oh, the owl. I was shocked. And I was wearing owl earrings at the time, and he said, oh, yeah, your earrings.
So that explains your affinity, maybe, for owls.
It was very strange. I never would have expected it. But apparently, I'm very interested in the Maya culture, and apparently that is the animal that is with me all the time.
Well, I love my cat intensely. I bet I'm a cat, because I always had an affinity for cats. They just.
So do I.
Oh yeah. Oh, so maybe you're a cat person too.
Possibly.
Yeah. Now being a poet, of course, I was interested in poet Wendy Drexler, who we had on this show, and she's going to be reading in my series at Newton Library in November. So how'd you get the poets? I mean, what do you look for in selection of poetry for this anthology?
Well, again, it was knowing
Right.
the authors or the poets involved. Do you know George Ellenbogen?
No, I'm
name?
familiar with him.
He's a retired professor at Bentley University. He has several anthologies of poetry, and we've been friends since my undergraduate days there. He was my favorite professor, and that's how he joined the book. And we also have the youngest person in the book, Annalise Merrigan. I did a PowerPoint presentation of Mount Auburn wildlife at her fourth grade class in Medford, and she was so inspired by the photographs that she asked her mother to bring her to Mount Auburn. And then she started going there with her mother, and she saw some red-tailed hawks. I met her there once, she and her mother, and she wrote a poem about them, about a red-tailed hawk, and she's also an excellent artist, and she illustrated a red-tailed hawk, which is also in her poem. And that's how that happened. And Wendy Drexler, of course, I knew before that. And in the very end, there's a poem by Mary Bernard, and
I've heard of her. Yeah, she's,
you know,
yeah, I don't know her personally, but
yeah. Okay, well, she's a friend of Wayne Peterson of Mass Audubon, and Wayne, of course, is in the book. And then he said, "My friend is a poet. Can you use something from her?" Which we didn't, and she ends the book. And I love her poem, but again, it's through knowing the poet themselves or someone who knows them, and that's how they came into the book.
Are you one of poetic sensibility? Do you like poetry, or is it?
I don't write any poetry.
You don't write, but do you like it? Do you enjoy it?
I do like some, yes.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think these poems really captured the cemetery?
Yes.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, coyotes. You did a big study of coyotes, right?
Oh, that! If you would have asked me what was the most memorable thing to happen at Mount Auburn Cemetery, it would be the year of the coyotes. In 2008, Big Caesar and his mate, well, I named it Big Caesar, had a litter of 8 pups, and we got to follow them around for a year, day after day. Sometimes we'd get there at 7 in the morning, drive around, and would see 5 or 6 of them just getting up from a grassy area at the cemetery and stretching and yawning. And this was just a regular thing. And to have this access to them for almost a year was just unbelievable. Camilla Fox, who's the founder of Project Coyote in California.
Camilla Fox, head of the Coyote.
Yeah,
I like that.
imagine, yeah, the irony. But she travels the country litigating for coyotes and trapping and things like that. But she told me after I had sent her a bunch of photographs that she uses in their publicity, she said, "My colleagues and I agree that they have never seen a family of coyotes followed for the length of time you followed them. We've never seen, none of us have ever experienced that." And that's because Mount Auburn Cemetery is a gated community. Once the coyote pair committed to having their pups, that even though there are people walking around and groundskeepers and photographers,
So coyotes live in gated communities, and they also have lawyers. This is,
yeah, right.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. So they stayed there. So we got to see them, and they would have 3 or 4 different dens, but we always knew where they were because someone would see them. So that was certainly the greatest memories, a year of following these coyotes around. It was an amazing experience.
Now, you say you've got some event. I forgot. You told me you had some event coming up or something around the book. Did you say that you wanted to mention?
Well, that we do as many book events, libraries, and like places as we can.
Upton Bell. Yeah. What could you talk about that? Yeah.
Upton Bell, who was formerly, in his younger years, a manager of the Boston Patriots, and he is one of our contributors. And Upton is a great fan of Mount Auburn Cemetery. And when I asked him, he said, "Oh my God, John, I go there all the time." And he climbs the tower, and his essay is very poignant. And as I also mentioned, Upton's new book, Present at the Creation, about his father, Bert Bell, who owned the Philadelphia Eagles, and his mother, Frances Upton, who was a Broadway actress. The book about their life, especially his father and the Philadelphia Eagles, will be out in November. So we're very happy to be able to tell people about that book. And we're looking forward to big things from it. Upton is a great guy, good friend, and I think this book is going to be a major book in the sports world.
Okay. Now, do you have something I'd you talked about reading from the book, didn't you?
Sure.
Okay.
I'll read from Kate Flora's essay, and her essay is the title on page 209. I had read the first paragraph and thought this was just the perfect title.
Okay.
Because we wanted to do a coffee table book of photographs and celebration of Mount Auburn Cemetery, but it doesn't really have a catchy title.
Okay.
This is by Kate Flora, Dead in Good Company. My mother was an amateur genealogist and a big history buff, so as a child I was often dragged to cemeteries so she could read the headstones, take her notes, and encourage us to admire the carvings and the crypts. Cemeteries in our part of Maine tended to be built on hilltops, affording those who wished to visit the dead marvelous vistas that left me with a sense that visiting those spots and mourning and remembering those who were gone was an act that should be done in a place where the beauty encouraged return and remembrance. Visiting cemeteries under my mother's wing and pondering what the heads had to say also left me with a deepened interest in history and a lingering curiosity about the stories behind the words.
Okay. And who wrote that again? I'm sorry.
It's Kate Flora. She is a mystery writer who lives in Maine.
Now, that's another good name, Flora.
Yes.
You got the fox, you got the flora. Yeah, I see.
Flora and fauna.
Yeah.
We did not plan that.
Yeah, no. But is he always looking for a hook to pull me on? So, how about you? You have something that?
Yeah, there's one thing I'd like to read. We chose William Martin's essay as our first essay. We kind of considered it
actually,
our mission
Dershkowitz
statement.
was your first.
Well, his
introduction.
His introduction.
Oh, okay.
But Bill Martin's essay is first, The Actor and the Hawk. But this sentence in the first paragraph of the book, I think, really sums up what we feel about Mount Auburn and why this book has been as successful as it has been. Stories tell us our truths. Since the first storyteller sat at a campfire, stories have helped us to make sense of all that passes before us and of all that hides in the shadows beyond the firelight. And this ancient cemetery is full of stories. And that really is what this book and Mount Auburn is all about. An ancient cemetery full of stories.
Okay.
And every author has stories in their own particular interests, their own take, their own look at the cemetery. And that's what, for us, the essence of the book and this experience has been.
I mean, are there any other cemeteries quite like Mount Auburn that you're aware of?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
In different parts. I travel a lot for work, and I know in Georgia and Savannah, the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. So there are plenty of places like that. But this kept us busy, and we focus on this. It's not as if we have a fixation on cemeteries.
Well, I also work at McLean Hospital, so if you do, we can.
Yeah, no, it's this is good. We're just going to focus on this.
Okay. And any other projects you guys are thinking of?
Well, talking about other cemeteries, people ask us what's your next project, and Forest Hill Cemetery.
Yeah, I did a poetry reading there once.
Oh, okay. So, I mean, it's another big cemetery, interesting cemetery. And one of our contributors, Dee Morris, is a historian and has written about that cemetery. And she would love for us to do this with that cemetery. And
that has a lot of character.
I at age 71, I don't know if I have enough energy for another 17 hard months of work to do that. But we've taken it under advisement, and if we have, well, Kim has the energy, but I don't know if I do. But that would be a likely spot where it's close, and it is another big cemetery. But it still doesn't have, I think, the cachet that Mount Auburn does.
Okay.
And finding a bunch of authors who know that cemetery well enough to do that. So I don't know if that's going to work, but we're thinking about it.
So, do you have anything like individually you're doing now, other than Mount Auburn? Like, do you have an individual project?
Well, my goal in particular, is to partner in some ways with companies that could help the cause, like, for example, Shade Grown Organic Coffee Company, because people need to understand that their purchases can help birds, and other like-minded products. Not that I want it to become a smorgasbord of material things, but the coffee thing is very important. And there's also a company that does natural rodent control. One of the problems is that we use so much poison, not just with pesticides, but with the animals, and then the raptors eat the animals, and then the animals, everybody dies.
Yeah.
And there was an incident with the Cambridge hawks, Buzz and Ruby, and Ruby had died from eating a rodent that had ingested insecticide.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's
Rodenticide, and whatever else.
Wow, that's pretty bad. You are both you're involved in environmental causes and things of that nature.
Well, you can't be doing this without being concerned about the environment. It comes with knowing wildlife, searching for wildlife, going to the cemeteries, going to other venues like Plum Island or Salisbury Beach, places like that. So if you go to these places, being concerned with the environment is a natural growth of being there at those places. I don't think you can do this without an interest in the environment, because we see what happens to birds. For instance, we go to lectures and we hear about certain birds that are on the decline, certain birds that are doing okay, and what the reasons are for that. And it's changes in the environment, changes in habitat that's been taken away. There are a lot of reasons, but if you do this, you are concerned about these things and these reasons. So it's a natural part of doing this.
So thank you, folks, for being here. And again, you can purchase this book at what bookstores?
Porter Square Books.
Okay.
Yeah, well, Amazon, of course.
Amazon.
At the gift shop at
Mount Auburn Cemetery.
Barnes and Noble.
Barnes and Noble.
At Mount